And I went to Sri Lanka and worked for many weeks and participated in the events after the tsunami, during which, of course, the country was devastated, huge number of people died. And I was even on the beach. I was meant to be staying on the beach where 1,000 people were killed. It was an extraordinary tragedy, an extraordinary event. And I remember arguing with the World Bank officials at the time in the country and with others that this was an ideal time to introduce an emergency basic income in which everybody could have basic security with which to rebuild their lives. If you remember, those of you who were there at the time, in fact, what happened was they threw a vast amount of money around with duplicating foreign aid packages. I remember even seeing a whole set of clothes that were totally inappropriate for the weather and living conditions of Sri Lanka. And the irony of ironies was that huge number of fishing boats and fishing tackle were supplied, duplicating what was there, and it led to overfishing, tremendous loss of fish populations. And that relates to my new book, which is called The Blue Commons. I'll come back to it later, just showing it here. And Sri Lanka, of course, is very much a country which depends in various ways on the sea and all that's in the sea around the country. So I'll come back to that later. I want to begin by saying that we are in a moment, a historical moment in the world, when we're at the crisis point of a global transformation in the nature of our economy and nature of our societies. And it's analogous to a book that was written in 1944 by Karl Polanyi called The Great Transformation. And his thesis was that in the 19th century, the ideology of laissez-faire capitalism, of free markets, had enabled finance to become an incredibly dominant force, and various inequalities and insecurities multiplied until there was a threat of the annihilation of civilization, as he put it. And of course, that threat was the precursor of a period of fascism, of depression, and the Second World War. And then after the war, there was an attempt to, what he put it, re-embed the economy in society with new forms of regulation, new forms of redistribution, new forms of social protection. Very critical point. So we had the welfare states in Western Europe and elsewhere, in which Beveridge and Bismarck principles of welfare were introduced, where compensatory policies for income loss were introduced. And this was what I call the ILO model. The ILO had been set up in 1919 to take labor out of international trade and give labor rights. And this meant giving various regulations, collective bargaining, tripartism, everything depended on labor, paid wage labor. And the welfare systems of the post-war era were intended to compensate for those who lost income because they couldn't labor, either through unemployment, through illness, accidents, maternity, and old age. So it was a model in which the essence was laborism. where it was intended to encourage full employment, full-time jobs, family wages, and all those things I've just mentioned. Now, that model broke down in the 1970s, essentially because the global economy was developing. So countries like Sri Lanka and countries like China and all developing countries became part of a global economy. So we've seen a period since the 1970s in which real wages in developing countries, in developed countries, in the rich OECD countries, have been stagnating and often falling for the group I'll mention later. Whereas the essence of the economic crisis of the 1970s and 80s led to an economics revolution. I'm an economist and I did my PhD at Cambridge. And at the time in the 1970s, we had a sudden economics revolution where all the teaching from Marxism and Ricardo and all the classical political economists were suddenly marginalized. And we had what's called the neoliberal economics revolution. Now, this is critical because it was led by political leaders like Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, various others, and it was the enshrinement of a free market ideology, an ideology in which the old social democratic institutions were to be dismantled, regulatory protections were to be taken away because they were an impediment to growth, economic growth. And of course, we had a transformation in development policy. But I want to argue that it's important for political activism, for academic research, for our welfare strategies, to realize that we're not living in a neoliberal age today. What's happened is that the neoliberal revolution of the 1980s was first and foremost the opportunity for global finance, the financial capital, to become the dominant world force. In the 1980s, finance was still a servant for investment, for capitalism, and was regulated. But once the financial markets were liberalized, financial power, particularly in the United States, in Wall Street and in the City of London, became the dominant force globally. And you cannot understand the crisis in Sri Lanka or the crisis in the global economy today without understanding the huge power of what I call Goldman Sachsism, and the biggest institution today, which is dominating 20% of the world's stock exchanges, which is BlackRock, through an algorithm called Aladdin. I've discussed all of that in a book called The Corruption of Capitalism. Very important to understand that we have a financialized world where the finance have turned what we have today into not a free market economy at all, but into rentier capitalism. What rentier capitalism means is that more and more of the income flows to the owners of assets, property, financial property, physical property, and so-called intellectual property. Now, the financialization led to a restructuring, if you like, of the international architecture that is dominating world governance. From the old Bretton Woods institutions set up after the Second World War, the World Bank, the IMF, the various regional banks, they were meant to be serving development, and they were powerful globally in developing countries. But what happened in the 1980s was that the power of these bodies increased enormously, and they indulged in what we all call structural adjustment. Now, structural adjustment was involving what's often called the Washington Consensus. And most important for my narrative is that it was a strategy to diminish the social state and to privatize everything that could be privatized and commodify everything that could be commodified. And in particular, established private property rights in land and resources in developing countries. Very crucial part of understanding what is happening today. And in my new book, The Blue Commons, I give a highlight to a particular piece of United Nations law that I believe was the most important single law passed by the United Nations. And that was what's called UNCLOS in 1982. UNCLOS means the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And what that did was essentially turn a vast part of the world, the oceans, into state property. They created exclusive economic zones around all countries with seashores. But what it did it in a neo-colonial way, in the sense that the country that did best was France and the United States. France, most of all. They got nearly 12 million square kilometers of sea given to them under UNCLOS. Australia, Russia, Britain did quite well. And all the way down, you find India didn't do very well. It got just over 2 million square kilometers. Sri Lanka got 500,000. And China got just a little bit more, hardly any. So the most populous developing countries did extremely badly out of UNCLOS. And what UNCLOS did, and I won't go into the details now, you maybe want to ask questions perhaps, or look through my work, but it led to the privatization. First comes the enclosure of the sea, just like the enclosure of the land by the state, which creates the basis for privatizing. So you have a privatizing process through fishing access agreements, through land being converted into aquaculture, mangroves being destroyed, and a whole series of financially led investments to take over and turn the assets of developing countries into rent devices. So we find that since UNCLOS came into effect, 1/3 of all the mangroves in the world have disappeared. They've been converted into prawn farms for export or used for something else, for tourism or whatever, and destroyed what I call blue commoners communities. And I document some of the terrible effects of privatizing the sea around Sri Lanka. Those of you who are from Sri Lanka know the details far better than I do. But it was part of the process of building rentier capitalism. And the next thing that happened was that the World Trade Organization passed a piece of legislation, which is the second most important piece of legislation internationally in this period. Because what it did was it listened to a group of American corporate chief executives who, quite near where I'm sitting now, outside Geneva, put together a strategy that became TRIPS, the trade-related aspects of international property rights, passed in 1994. And ironically, the leading person in that group that shaped that piece of legislation that was adopted by the World Trade Organization, or what became the World Trade Organization after GATT helped bring it into practice, was the chief executive of Pfizer. Now, I should remind you now, just in case you've forgotten, that Pfizer is one of the three biggest pharmaceutical companies that had the vaccines for COVID. And they made billions and billions and billions of dollars from exploiting all of us because TRIPS established the US intellectual property rights system and gave strength to patents. You cannot understand the economic system today without understanding the role of patents and intellectual property more generally. Before TRIPS came into effect, fewer than 1 million patents were filed each year globally, mainly by the United States. Today, well over 3 million each year are filed, and over 16 million fake patents are in force today globally. What did patents do? Patents give a guaranteed monopoly profit to the owner of the patent for 20 years. And with pharmaceuticals, they arranged that you could have what's called an evergreening policy, which would give them up to another 20 years in all but name. A patent, in other words, is the opposite of a free market capitalism. It's rentier capitalism. A free market means you can compete, but if you have a patent, nobody can compete with you. So you can charge very high prices. You may make a price that's much higher than what would be the market price if there was competition. That's rent. That's what rent is all about. And intellectual property, not only with patents, but with copyright, with industrial brands, with industrial designs, dominates the global economy and gives those big, rich countries the chance to become rentier states. Now, of course, when TRIPS was introduced in 1994, China was not a member of the world of GATT or the World Trade Organization, and it only joined in 2001. And when the Americans made TRIPS, they ignored China, just as China was practically ignored in UNCLOS. But then in 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, and since then has become the biggest rentier state. It now files far more patents than the United States, far more than the United States, South Korea, the European Union put together. So each year, the strength of the Chinese rentier state is growing relative to the United States, and Europe has become a small player. This has altered the dynamics of international capitalism. And of course, in addition, what we've seen is that we've moved into an era of what I call neo-mercantilism. Now, neo-mercantilism, those of you who are not familiar with economics, is quite simple to understand in the sense that individual countries identify their corporate champions and they give them vast subsidies to increase their competitiveness with the champions of other countries or other countries that don't have champions because they don't have the resources. So what has happened is that the biggest countries, particularly China, the United States, European Union, Japan, have been giving subsidies. Again, I give an example of fisheries. Fisheries get $35 billion worth of subsidies globally each year. And they're mainly for fuel and capacity enhancing investments in bigger boats, bigger equipment. So what we've seen is long distance fleets from China first, then Russia, then the United States, then Spain, then Japan, moving around the world and marauding and depleting the fish populations of developing countries. Various reasons that have been given strength, having fishing access agreements because that was required under UNCLOS. And the biggest change that's taken place is that in 1985, China just had 13 boats that had long-distance fishing capacity. In other words, only 13 boats were able to go and fish outside Chinese waters because they didn't have any more. Today, China has 17,000 long-distance fishing vessels that are marauding the sea and taking vast amounts of fish, depleting and going for short-term profit maximization. And other big fishing companies are getting financial backing by private equity, which wants to maximize short-term profits, and they don't give a damn, excuse me, but they don't give a damn about depleting the stocks, whether it be around Sri Lanka or around Mauritania or around Peru, wherever it is, because they can move on and diversify out of fishing if the fish populations decline. That's just one example. You see it on land, you see it with aquaculture. I was looking up the figures. You've only got a small aquaculture capacity in Sri Lanka today. I think you're fortunate in that respect, and you should do everything possible to make sure it stays small and is not commercialized like in many countries, which leads to vast profits, destructive tendencies, destruction of communities. Now, the Rentier Capitalism model has gone with the development of a new global class structure. And what has happened is that Rentier Capitalism has meant that the more and more of the income and flow of power and wealth go to the owners of property, and less go to the providers of labor. That's pretty clear. It's a global phenomenon. It's found in China just as much as the United States or anywhere else. But in addition, one of the things that's happened with rentier capitalism is that we've moved into an era of chronic economic uncertainty. What does that mean? It means that we are facing situations where we can't predict when the next economic shock is going to hit us. We can't predict if it's going to affect you, me, or anybody else. We are all vulnerable. We all lack what I call robustness, in the sense none of us are immune to being hit by a pandemic. We've already had 6 viral pandemics this century, but more will be coming. But we don't know who's going to be hit hard or less hard. So we're all vulnerable. We're all lacking robustness, but we're also all lacking resilience. Resilience means the capacity to handle shocks, the capacity to cope with shocks, the capacity to recover from shocks. And this provides a totally new phenomenon of chronic uncertainty, which goes with chronic debt, which grows with chronic stress, which grows with rising morbidity, illnesses, social illnesses, and increasing deaths of despair, suicides, and all of the symptoms. And this is where the growth of the class structure comes in. Because the class structure that I've described, with a plutocracy at the top, an elite, the rentiers, very wealthy, they can protect themselves, they can have resilience, they gain in pandemics. But the old salariat, the old ILO model of the proletariat are disappearing. They don't get satisfactory social rights. And they're disappearing because many of them are being pushed down, down, down into the precariat. And the precariat is growing all over the world. People in chronic insecurity, people who have to rely on money wages that are volatile, uncertain, and falling in real terms, people who are losing rights of citizenship, and most of all are feeling like supplicants. They rely on favors, they rely on charity, they rely on people being generous. And this is undignifying, this is stressful. And this is creating a situation of anomie, of despair, of alienation, of anxiety and anger. And the political challenge to us today is to harness that anger in a constructive, progressive way to overthrow and dismantle rentier capitalism, expose it for what it is. It's illegitimate, it's amoral, it's unjustified economically or socially or politically. And it is creating dangers of populist politicians, playing on the fears and the insecurities, promising to bring back yesterday, like the Donald Trumps, like the Viktor Orbáns in Europe, like the various types that have dominated politics in Sri Lanka and India and so on. But we need to understand rentier capitalism. We need to understand the precariat. And we need to understand that in conditions of uncertainty, and this is my final point, in conditions of uncertainty, you need ex-ante protection. You need to give people security that they know that tomorrow morning, whatever happens, they'll have enough to survive on. And the day after, and the day after that. This means we need to move towards a basic income. It's not a panacea, but we've done pilots in Madhya Pradesh, in Delhi, in Africa, in Latin America, in Canada, in the United States. 100 pilots now have all pointed to the same things. They reduce stress. They improve child nutrition. They provide people with security needed to pursue a life of dignity. They help in reducing inequality, reducing insecurities, reducing uncertainty. They lead to children staying longer in school and children learning more when they're in school. They learn and they become social citizens. And above all, we found that it's the biggest, most emancipatory policy for women. Because a basic income is meaning individual payments for each man and each woman equally, as men and women individually. Even if they're married and in families, they get it individually. So that they can walk out of abusive relationships more easily. They can handle the ability to be an independent participant in the household, in the family, in the community, and as citizens. In the end, these are the things that development is all about. I will stop there, but I think we have the beginnings of a progressive politics, and the pandemic has accelerated the capacity because it's forced people to ask questions that weren't being asked before. I did a video with a musical group called Massive Attack. And the Massive Attack, you can see it on YouTube, has gone viral in various languages. Hundreds of thousands of people have looked at it and sent me messages on it. And I think, and I'm sure Sarath will agree with me, that we are in a moment where if we have the courage and not put off by phony arguments, we can move decisively towards demanding that every individual in every society should have basic economic security. That is what we should do. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Guy. I'm going to now stop recording.